Hello everyone, salam, namaste, adab. And after 2 days, 2 consecutive Saturdays off, we are back again with Professor Salil Mishra and Professor Bodh Prakash, going to tell us linguistic roots of partition, culture, identity, and nation in the literature of partition. As you know, Professor Salil Mishra and Bodh Prakash both have appeared earlier also. Professor Mishra is a professor of history, School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University, and Bodh Prakash is also, he's retired as professor of English, but is still associated with the university. Introductory and concluding remarks will be given by Sukrita Pal Kumar, who is a well-known academician, cultural critic, cultural literary critic, and associated with she is former fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and former Aruna Asif Ali Chair, Delhi University. She has written a lot of articles and books on partition literature. The book is on Asmat Chughtai also, I believe. So I'm inviting Sukrita Pal Kumar to have a formal introductory remark.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be talking to you all, and thank you very much, Alisa, for inviting me to give introductory remarks and maybe concluding remarks as well. I don't know where to start from. I don't know. Basically, I have been intrigued with this entire question of language and the decisions, political decisions that have been taken for a very long time, vis-a-vis particularly Hindi, Urdu, and also Bengali on the other side. And I have always thought of that act of the Britishers. This was in 1803, when at Fort William College, actually some kind of a dividing line came up between Hindi and Urdu. And up until then, Hindi and Urdu had a very healthy dialogue between the two. And in terms of all the literatures that were produced, whether in Rekhta or Rekhti as it was known, or Hindavi as it was called, Ghalib called his Urdu Hindi at some point, because Urdu and Hindi were almost kind of married to each other. And the divorce started to happen in 1803 in a very significant way, when the Britishers decided that the Devanagari script should be used for Hindi and Urdu should be written in not the Devanagari script, but the Persian script. Now, that I think, and not just that, I think probably that was a starting point where also Hindi and Urdu started to be aligned with communities, Hindus and Muslims. And that was kind of a very heavy suggestive note with which that college set up in Calcutta. A certain kind of borderlines began to happen. But by the time it was 1947, the divide was almost complete, but we have a lot of literature happening in Hindi and Urdu. And the dialogue between the literatures were very strong in terms of very healthy. And the give and take and the negotiations that happened in terms of thought and creativity went on in the form of dialogues parallel to each other in the Hindi literature and Urdu literature. So while the traditions, one could make out the traditions were, could be identified as Hindi and Urdu, the literary traditions, but the dialogue enriched each with the other. And by the time we come to 1947 and all the debates that happened about languages, and Urdu was almost like banished in one sense from its own country, because Urdu was born either say in Dakkani or in the north around Lucknow and Delhi. But it was almost kind of banished in one sense, because it went to the other side of the border. And there has been a lot of reaction to that, because Urdu didn't come naturally, say, to people who even now, who live in, say, even in the Punjab. And there's been a lot of linguistic conflict happening there because people want Punjabi, for instance, in Lahore rather than Urdu. So this has been kind of an unnatural political development. And when you look at literatures, even of 60s and 70s, and you read people like, say, Rajendra Singh Bedi's stories or Krishan Chandra's stories, or who are supposed to be Urdu writers, and you read them, you will, if you just listen to the language that they write, if you listen and don't look at the script, you might sort of conclude that it's Hindi and not Urdu, because it's Hindustani actually. And similarly, Kamleshwar's Hindi, if you were to read Kamleshwar, you would feel it's kind of like Urdu, and Krishna Sokti is Hindi. There's so much of Urdu vocabulary that is used. So, so one feels that a lot of damage happened to the dialogue between the two, and post 70s, 80s, the divorce started to happen more and more, though on the Indian side, the romance with Urdu has continued, but the learning hasn't happened. So the learning of the language or the teaching of the language hasn't happened because it's not officially recognized in many regions, except for Kashmir and Lucknow, which used to be quite there. But so what I'm trying to say is that this linguistic mess up that happened, it created a lot of politics, created the mess up and continued into also some kind of a long shadow of partition, as a result of which, if you were to look at the Urdu that is written today, is a little more Persianized and a little more aligned with the Muslim community, and Hindi aligned with the Hindus. And also the distancing happens also because the vocabulary is very distinctly Hindi or Urdu. So, so this also means that, you know, since language itself is culture and culture is embedded in language, so there have been cultural divisions also that began to happen. And also in the formation of nations, the two nations, India and Pakistan, there also the political decisions on Hindi and Urdu. And we know one of the, one of the reasons why Rahi Masoom Raza is grappling with this whole question of Hindi and Urdu, even in his fiction. And I'm sure Bodh Prakash is going to be talking about it. And I am very curious myself to see how, you know, this, of course, Radcliffe's line drawing happened in terms of the physical borders that he drew so irresponsibly by dividing cultures. But similar kind of dividing lines also happened between Hindi and Urdu, which have been very damaging. And so let's see what the two speakers that we have today are going to say. The resultant literatures that happened in the modern period in particular, and the postmodern as well, and particularly in Hindi and Urdu. And also we know the big issue that happened on the Bengal side vis-a-vis Bengali and Urdu, where Bengali needed to be recognized more because that was the language, mother tongue of the people of Bengal. So anyway, I think I would give more comments at the end. I'm also very curious to listen to both Professor Salil and Professor Bodh Prakash. Off to the two of them.
Thank you very much. So now it is between Professor Bodh Prakash and Salil Mishra to choose who is coming first. I'm giving them the leverage now. So both Prakash ji aap aayenge or Salil Mishra ji, it's between you. Please unmute yourself.
Salil, is that all right? Should I go on first, or would you like to?
Whatever, it's either is fine with me. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Razi Saab, Sorry, 1 second. I have to- Right. Okay.
I guess some people have questioned about the volume, and I do not know, Faisal, whether the volume is to their end or it is our problem. I don't think that it is.
No, I can hear everyone okay, so
Yeah,
it must
so
be
it is
there.
individual's problem. Okay, Bodh Prakash, go ahead, please.
Am I audible and
Yes, yes,
am I
yes,
audible
very
to
much.
everybody?
Loud and clear.
Very clear.
Thank you. Actually, the title of this presentation there are two titles. I mean, Salil is to talk about the linguistic roots of partition, and I'm supposed to talk about identity, culture, and nation in the narratives of partition. So, in a sense, I mean, Salil will be talking about the earlier period, the development of this divide between Hindi and Urdu and its various ramifications. I'm actually coming in from 1947, really, and what happens to both these languages, as well as the kinds of issues that are raised, not just on account of language, because language, as Sukrita is correctly pointing out, is a part of the larger culture and identity and the relationship with nation particularly. So the creation of Pakistan and its underlying logic, or illogic as somebody might call it, raised major questions related to identity, culture, and the nation. Radcliffe's line, I mean, please remember that Radcliffe had never traveled east of the Suez. He was the man who came and drew this line across the subcontinent. This line had ramifications that went far beyond what was presumed by many to be an expedient solution to an apparently intractable problem in 1947. And of course, therefore, apart from the terrible loss of lives and property and the dislocation of people, and of course, the subsequent wars between India and Pakistan, partition forced Muslims in India to confront issues related to culture, language, and identity, and their relationship to the nation in ways that they had never imagined before. Communal Hindus questioned their loyalty to Hindustan. Urdu became the language of the enemy, and Islam, the religion of so-called invaders or foreigners. I think this was a very, very important moment when it comes to the issue of language, that in 1947, shortly after Pakistan is created, Urdu is declared the national language of Pakistan. And of course, it has its own trajectory, as we know that in the case of East Pakistan and how this unravels there. But as far as India is concerned, this has very, very serious implications, because suddenly overnight, Urdu becomes the language of the enemy. These are the people who were responsible, the argument goes, these are the people who were responsible for breaking up the country, and now this is their language. Therefore, Islam gets otherized, it gets sort of becomes, as I said, the language of the enemy. Similar things happened, of course, with regard to Islam. And many creative writers, particularly Urdu writers, took up these and several other issues in short stories and novels, also in their poetry. And some of the major names that come to mind: Manto, Krishan Chandra, Rajendra Singh Bedi, Ismat Chugtai, Jamila Hashmi, Abdullah Hussain, Kurutalan Haidar, Intizar Hussain. These are some names that come readily to mind. And many, if not all of them, are actually writing mainly in the 2 or 3 decades, 40s, 50s, and 60s. In comparison, the literary output in Hindi on partition was rather limited. And I'm saying this with a lot of how shall I put it, with a lot of apprehension. I mean, I know I can be challenged on this, but I think that if you look at, of course, we have Bhisham Sani, we have Kamleshwar, we have Mohan Rakesh, as Sukrita mentioned some of these names. But in terms of the overall quantum of work that is available in Hindi, perhaps they are fewer when compared alongside the Urdu output. How does one explain this? One possible explanation could be that it was the Urdu-speaking Muslim community that was perhaps most affected by partition, and therefore the output, particularly Muslims from erstwhile United Provinces. But that would, strictly speaking, not be true, because there were lots of Punjabi Hindus and Sikhs who were also displaced on the other side. It could also be argued that most of the affected intelligentsia of both Hindus and Muslims from North India wrote in Urdu. And that could be one of the reasons. In any case, even though Hindi had carried out, sort of carved out a separate and a very substantial readership for itself since the time of Premchand, Urdu poetry and prose was not really sidelined. Many of the Urdu writers, which I've just mentioned, they were acclaimed literators, and their popularity did not abate even till the 1960s. Now we can go into, in the discussion, we can go into the reasons as to why this happened. I mean, of course, Urdu was sort of not given any importance really in India after partition, and yet the popularity and the readership of Urdu continued well beyond that. Nevertheless, as I said, the declaration of Urdu as the national language of Pakistan did have its repercussions in India. In fact, though some of you may remember that in the Constituent Assembly debates on the issue of the national language, Urdu was not even mentioned. So in spite of the fact that there were some, according to some, and many according to others, Hindu Urdu writers, the myth of Urdu being a language of Muslims and Hindi of Hindus persisted. It is in this context that I would like to talk about a Muslim Hindi writer of a somewhat later period who took up the larger question of what it meant to be a Muslim in post-partition India, namely Rahi Masum Raza, the writer that Sukrita mentioned. I'm currently sort of engaged with doing some work on him. And he's particularly significant for the following reasons. Rahi Masum Raza, who I'll refer to as Rahi in short, produced most of his major works from about the mid-60s till 1992 when he passed away. He was a unique bilingual writer. Perhaps the only one he can be compared with is Premchand, but even Premchand did not quite do what Rahi did. Rahi wrote all his fiction, non-fiction prose in Hindi, and he wrote all his poetry in Urdu. Some of you may be familiar with one of his most well-known novels, a novel called Aadha Gaon, which was then translated subsequently by Gillian Wright into English. It's available under the title The Feuding Families of Village Gangauli. Interestingly, this was his his first major novel, and sort of it really sort of gave him a certain position in the world of Hindi letters. It's interesting that this novel was actually originally written by Rahi in the Perso-Arabic script. He wrote it in that script, but there were no Urdu publishers who were willing to publish it at that time. His friend K.P. Singh finally transliterated it into the Devanagari script, and it was finally published in 1966. The Urdu version, that is the version in the Perso-Arabic script, was published in 2003, more than a decade after his death. Why is this significant? It is significant because for a variety of reasons. Firstly, like we've been saying, this association of Urdu with Muslims and Hindi with Hindus is, of course, in a very obvious way, challenged by the presence of a Muslim writer who is writing in Hindi. Of course, there are also, as I said, Hindu writers who are writing in Urdu. But my concern today here is with this kind of a trajectory where you have a Muslim writer who writes in Hindi, and you know there are a few others like this people, for instance, like Asghar Wajahat, Shani, and a few others who were writing in Hindi. Uh, but Rahi was different in some senses from all of them. He made some very, very strong statements and took very strong positions on the Hindi-Urdu issue. For instance, he said that Urdu is not a different language. It is a shaily of Hindi. It's just a style of Hindi. Now I know that this is a position which was taken probably around the early part of the 20th century by some people. So in the 60s and 70s, this was perhaps some kind of it was not very normal for people to take this position, but he did. He also said that Urdu should be written in the Nagari script. That will ensure that many more people are able to read it. He also argued that the script does not create a language, far less a religion or a community. And therefore, the whole issue of this division between Urdu and Hindi and Hindus and Muslims needs to be rethought, it needs to be re-examined. His deep engagement with the language question was integrally related to his ideological commitment to the secular cause. Throughout the 1980s, he's lived for a very substantial. Sorry? Sorry? I'm not raising my hand. Razi Saab, I don't know how this is happening.
There is some problem. It's been happening for 3-4 people, and then there are strange messages. I hope something can be done about it.
Faisal?
Yeah, there are all kinds of hands being raised. I don't know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second, I'll take
There's
care of
some
it.
troll if that can be.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. Faisal is trying to take care about it. Okay.
Yeah, right.
All right, go ahead and you continue, please.
Shall I continue?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. Throughout the 80s, when he lived in Bombay, that is Mumbai, he was very critical. He went on public record criticizing and denouncing Marathi chauvinism, Bal Thackeray, Suleiman Seth, L.K. Advani, the RSS, and similar bodies. Unlike many other Hindi writers, and this includes Premchand, and like his contemporaries, Shani, Asghar Wajahat, etc., he offered a peep into Muslim homes and life and language with all its warts, with all its beauty, with all its ugliness, something that was unknown to the Hindu reading public. Particularly middle-class Muslim homes, these had not been represented in Hindi literature. Even somebody like Premchand, who did have Muslim characters in his works, his representation was not really an insider's view in that sense. So Rahi was significant for that reason. He revealed the challenges, as I said, of being Muslim in India post-partition. Its angst, its fear, bewilderment, its othering, and the ambiguous relationship with Pakistan. The contestation between languages, Hindi, Urdu, but though in his case, it was more specifically Bhojpuri and Urdu, it is rooted in the larger questions. It is rooted in the larger cultural politics of his time. Language then becomes a metaphor for religion, sometimes caste, class, and even gender. The two novels that I will be referring to briefly, my examples will be from these two novels. One is, of course, Aadha Gaon, and the other one is Topi Shukla. And in the second novel, particularly, there are these verbal duels between his Hindu and the Muslim character, which are underlined by communal prejudices and cultural stereotypes. So there are two broad issues that I will be taking up. One is the the real problems that arise in the attempt to create discrete Hindu and Muslim identities in the realm of lived experience. And here I'll take just two examples from Adagaon. The second issue that I will be raising.
Excuse me, I think there is some kind of hacking that is happening.
Faisal?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, I'm trying. Just hold on. I've logged the meeting, so I'm trying to identify him.
He has logged the
It's still here.
He has logged the meeting and he's trying to this has happened after a long time.
I think some sort of program is being used. It's not somebody manually doing it.
Huh?
Yeah, it's happening with different names.
Yeah, I think that there's some program. You may have to change your meeting next time. Just 1 second.
So should he continue talking or?
No,
it's very unnerving, the pictures.
It's
Yeah,
very distracting, Razi sir. We need to do something about this.
Yes.
He's
either we
trying
need to
his
log
best.
in again or something.
Up. So you guys can stop your video, right? Faisal, can you turn off the video so that only audio can be?
Okay, I think I might have found it. Is it gone for everybody?
No, there are two Salils. So there is, and the one which raised hands, that's the one which is.
So there are multiple identities of Salil which are showing up.
That's right.
Okay, 1 second. Let me report this one first.
Sorry, bear with us. I mean.
Okay, so that one is taken care of. Find the other one.
Only Faisal can do this thing. I mean, I'll be totally out of this.
So I see only one Salil.
I also see only
Yes.
one.
Now it's okay. Now now there is just me. But before that there were two, and the other one was the shady one.
So now Faisal, you log the meeting. No more anybody can come. And
So yes, so what I've done is I've enabled the waiting room. Okay. And I will only allow somebody if I know personally that yes, this person is, otherwise they will have to just.
That's fine.
I think it's time for you to now change the link. It has been out there for a very long time.
All right. So next time you change it. Okay. All right. Okay. So go ahead, please.
Okay.
Sorry, cut it. Yeah, I can understand. It's quite disturbing, right?
So as I was saying that the second issue that I will raise will be this contestation between two languages. In the case of Rahi, it is between Bhojpuri and Bhojpuri and Urdu. And the underlying stereotypes that smack of cultural arrogance that may exist between the closest friends across the religious divide. So the language then somehow even when people are very well inclined, even when they are very progressive, very enlightened, somehow the linguistic cultural identity is so strongly embedded that it leads to certain kind of arrogance almost, which Rahi flags. So let me begin with the first issue that I referred to, which is the difficulty and impossibility of creating these discrete Hindu and Muslim identities. Now, some of you may be familiar with this novel Adagaon, but I'll briefly sort of just tell you that it's a story really about a Shia village called Gangoli, Rahi himself came from Ghazipur, and this was his own village. So it's a lot of it is, of course, his about his own family and about his own life. It's a village which is dominated by Shia Sayyid landlords, who are big landlords, and there are these Hindus who are Rajputs, who are Ahirs, who are sort of in quotes Chamars and Bhangis and so on. He uses these terms because they are prevalent in the village that he lives in. And one incident which I'll only refer to, but I'll not quote, is that of so the entire novel is really about Muharram and how the entire village actually spends the whole year preparing for this very, very major festival or major event. And several majlises are held, and there are all kinds of nohas and matams which are rendered, and then the great taziyas which are taken out, the great tazia which is taken out through the village and taken to the tomb of Nuruddin. This is a local kind of saint, if you wish, and his shrine is where the tazia is finally placed. So as the procession the tazia is taken in procession through the village, one of the customs is that the procession is preceded by a group of latet, lathi wielding ahirs. And their job is actually to knock off the eaves, the projecting eaves of the houses, which would otherwise, and therefore allow the tazia to pass through unhindered. The practice is that every year people build their eaves in such a way that they project outwards, so that the ahirs then will come and knock them down. That being a kind of suggestion that Imam Hussain has kind of accepted their prayers, or sort of blessed them. Now, it so happens in this novel that one year a Brahmin widow, the builder, whoever builds her eaves, doesn't build them long enough. They don't project outward enough. And so the tazia passes by without knocking those eaves out, and she gets very upset. She comes to Hamad Mia, who's one of the Shia landlords, and she complains to him and says that, terrible things will happen to me. Imam Sahib will get really upset, and, I'm very worried about the well-being of my sons. They don't take much notice of her, and, they sort of dismiss her complaint. As it so happens, her son is accused of a murder. He's indicted, he's sentenced to death, and she gets very desperate. She takes offerings to the tazia, and she sort of begs Imam Hussain to spare her son. When the case is sort of there is an appeal against the decision, it so happens that the government case is weak and her son is let off. When Abu Mia, who's the lawyer who's representing her sons, asks for his fees, she says, what fees? Imam Hussain saved my sons. It's an interesting example of how this widow is a Brahmin widow. I mean, she's not Muslim, she's not Shia, and yet she has such great faith in Imam Hussain, and she, basically believes that it is he who has listened to her prayers. That is one example. The second example, which I will, if Sukrita, you will permit me, I will quote from the original text, which is, the reason why I'm doing this is I could give you the English translation, but I think that it doesn't quite bring out the contestation between the two languages. This is a conversation which takes place between two students from Aligarh Muslim University in the 46 elections. When they're coming to campaign for the Muslim League, they come to the village Gangwali, and this is a village in which all Hindus and Muslims speak Bhojpuri. That's their language. They don't know Urdu. Urdu is far off. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the educated classes. And so this is what happens when they come to this village. हम लोग अलीगढ़ से आ रहे हैं, एक लड़के ने कहा। ए साहब, क्या हुआ, छुट्टी है आजकल? कम्मो ने सवाल किया। जी नहीं, छुट्टी तो नहीं है, मगर आपने सुना होगा कि इलेक्शन होने वाले हैं। ई तो हम सुन रहे हैं। आपके वालिद और वालिदा भी वोटर हैं। यह सुनकर कम्मो को नशा आ गया। उसने पहली बार अपनी माँ के लिए किसी से वालिदा ना सुना था, वरना वह ना तो माँ थी ना बीवी, वह तो सिर्फ रहमान बोध थी। मुस्कुरा दिया। अच्छा, ये बताइए कि अलीगढ़ पाकिस्तान चला जाइए कि यहीं रहिए? हम लोगों की कोशिश तो यही है कि अलीगढ़ पाकिस्तान में शामिल हो, क्योंकि वह इस्लामी तहजीब का एक रोशन मिनारा है। मिनारा? कमो हैरान हो गया। ए साहब, हम तो सुन रहा कि वहाँ एक तो यूनिवर्सिटी है और आप कह रहे हैं कि वो रोशन मिनारा है। लड़के मुस्कुरा दिए। बोलिए, देखिए बात असल दरअसल ये है। ए साहब सुनिए हमारी सीधी बात। अगर अलीगढ़ पाकिस्तान में जाए को हुए तो साफ साफ बता दीजिए, काहे मारे कि तब हमरे वालिद और हमारी वालदा आपको वोट ना दे सके। जी, पाकिस्तान ना बना तो ये 8 करोड़ मुसलमान यहाँ अछूत बनकर रह जाएंगे। दूसरा बोला। ए भाई, हमें तो ऐसा लग रहा कि आप लोगन का पढ़ा लिखा सब बेकार भया। काहे मारे कि आप लोगन को तो यही ना मालूम कि भंगी चमार अछूत होते हैं। हम कौन भंगी चमार है? और जो अछूत हुई वे ना करिए, वो को कोई अछूत कैसे बना दिए साहब? आप बताइए, तने तने हम सुने। This conversation becomes progressively more interesting, because the boys from Aligarh, they keep on trying. They try their level best. They get more and more upset. They get very frustrated by this by somebody they consider a very illiterate and uneducated person, and then they keep on painting these very graphic scenarios of what is going to happen if Pakistan is not created, and they say, if Pakistan is not created, then the Hindus will tie cows in their in your mosques. And he says, well, if we go away to Pakistan, how does it make a difference whether they tie horses or cows? It's not as if they want to offer namaz there. This is very strange. He says, we go away to Pakistan and we want them to look after our mosques. The final nail in the coffin really is when they get really upset, these boys. And he says, uh, they get very angry. He says, ठीक है, लेकिन जब हिंदू आपकी माँ बहन को निकाल ले जाएं तो फरियाद ना कीजिएगा। हमारी माँ बहन को कौन बहनचोद निकाल के ले जा सकता है जी? कम्मों का बदन गुस्से से थर थर कांपने लगा। आप लोग जौन एक वक्त हमरे दरवाजे पे ना होते तो तंगिया चीर देते। सामने के हाथ में मिट्टी के तेल लिए बोतल लटकाए एक चमार आ रहा था। कम्मों की आवाज सुनकर वह रुक गया। सुन रहा था? कम्मो ने उसको पूछा। क्या बात है मियाँ? उसने पूछा। ये लोग अलीगढ़ से हमें ये बताए आए हैं कि जब हिंदुस्तान आजाद हो जाइए तो तुम लोग हमारे लोगन की माँ बहन को निकाल ले जाइए हो। कम्मो ने बात बता दी। अरे राम राम, चमार बिल्कुल घबरा गया। आप लोग तो लिखल पढ़ल बुझाताड़ी। तने सोचो कि हमनी के जियत कौन मियन लोगन की बहन मतारी की तरफ देख सकेला? आप लोगों से अच्छा तो हमरे चमरवे हैं, कम्मू ने कहा, जो माँ बहन के निकाल लिए जाने की बात सुन के राम राम करने लगा। And so it ends. The basic issue here, of course, is apart from the fact that they are speaking in different languages, this so-called illiterate Kammo, who's Kamruddin actually, he's called Kammo in this village. He questions some of the very fundamental assumptions of the Muslim League ideology, wherein he says, if Aligarh is not going to be a part of India, of Pakistan, then how does it make a difference to me whether it is created or not? If my village is not going to go to Pakistan, then why should I care? And so it goes. So that is one. There are several other examples in Adagaon which expand on this issue. But let me come to Topi Shukla, which is the second novel of Rahi. Now, as I said, Rahi questioned the idea of Urdu being the language of Muslims. he is, in fact, in Aadha Gaon, when someone speaks in Urdu, somebody who's gone to the city and speaks in Urdu, he's immediately rebuked for having forgotten his forefathers' language, namely Bhojpuri. In fact, in one incident, when the majlis is happening, and one gentleman who occupies, who's sitting in a very sort of, he's sitting right in front of the, in front of the spectators and watching this. So he gets up for a while, and when he comes back, his place has been taken up by somebody else. So he says, he asks him, why are you sitting in my place? And that person says, but why are you speaking in Urdu? Almost as if speaking in Urdu is the greater violation than is having taken this place. Rai argued for Urdu, as I said, in the Nagari script. I've already given you the history of Aadha Gaon being written in the Nagari, in the Persian-Arabic script earlier. He said he represented the cultural differences between Hindus and Muslims with telling effect through the distinction between these two languages, Bhojpuri and Urdu. In fact, through the pronunciation of certain syllables which are specific to Hindi and Urdu, particularly in Topi Shukla. So in Topi Shukla, very brief, very sort of short kind of way, it's really about the friendship between a Muslim Ifan and the Hindu Topi Shukla, who are actually, they become friends in a village which is divided by all kinds of cultural prejudices. They are both, of course, very strongly opposed to all communal ideas, but as I said, there are these submerged, covert prejudices regarding language, particularly, and regarding culture, which occasionally come to the surface, even when these two very well-intentioned people, talk to each other. And I'll give you a few examples of this. The reason why I'm saying this is because the medium in the medium, that is the language itself in Topi Shukla, is part of the message. Well-meaning progressive people like Ifan and Sakina, his wife, they are unable to get rid of their inherent arrogance when it comes to language. Sakina, for instance, refuses to learn the correct pronunciation of Topi's name. His real name is Balbhadra Shukla, and she constantly mispronounces it, and even when she's corrected, she refuses to correct herself. She also mocks at Topi's Hindi, and she, of course, dismisses his Urdu mispronunciations. So let me just give you a couple of examples about these two issues, and I think that should be good as far as examples go. Okay. This is a conversation between Topi himself and Ifan. मैं मजाक नहीं कर रहा, टोपी ने कहा, मेरे प्रॉब्लम का यही एक हल रह गया है, एक बार शादी कर लूं, फिर देखूंगा ये सारी दुनिया को, फिर नहीं, फिर कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता, फर्क, बस आप लोग शब्दों के तलवे चाटते रहिए, वे बिगड़ गया. This is, it's very interesting that Topi, he knows that they are sort of, they don't like his pronunciation, and they're constantly checking him. But his point is that the meaning behind words is more important than the pronunciation. Whereas both Sakina and Ifan, they constantly keep mocking him for the way he's pronouncing certain words. Sakina और टोपी में गहरी दोस्ती थी, परंतु दोनों में एक मिनट नहीं पड़ती थी. सकीना हिंदुओं के बहुत खफा रहती थी, क्योंकि उसके घर वाले आजादी के बलवों में मारे गए थे. टोपी, वे बोली, मैं तुम लोगों को खूब समझती हूँ, यहाँ बैठकर नामालूम कौन शील हो जाते हो. प्रगतिशील, टोपी ने सहारा दिया. हाँ, अर्गति प्रगतिशील होगा कुछ. यह मुई भी कोई जबान है कि बोलो तो जबान छिनाल औरत की तरह 100 बल खाए. वह बात कहो, ये उपमाएं क्यों लुटा रही हो, टोपी ने कहा. क्या कह रही थी. अरे, तो क्या मैं तुमसे डरती हूँ कि नहीं कहूंगी, सकीना हत्थे से उखड़ गई। क्या यह रही थी कि बैठकर प्रगतिशील बनते हो मगर खाल के नीचे तुम हिंदू ही हो। अरे तो मैंने कब कहा कि मैं मुसलमान हो गया? टोपी बोला, मैं कोई पागल हूं कि मेजोरिटी कम्युनिटी को छोड़कर माइनॉरिटी कम्युनिटी में आ जाऊंगा, एटसेट्रा। This is how it continues in a different kind of way. And finally, the example which I think is even more revealing. This is when Topi is first introduced to Irfan's wife. He hasn't met her before. He says, "ये मेरी बीवी सकीना है." यह अंदाजा तो मैंने भी लगा लिया था। इसकी जबान पर हंसना मत, इरफान ने कहा। इसके घर में उर्दू बोली जाती है। यह दादी की जिद से में गवार बन गया है। भाभी ये बात नहीं है। फिर क्या बात है? सकीना ने कहा। उसकी आंखों में शरारत की कंदीलें जल गईं। ये मेरे बचपन के दोस्त बलभद्र नारायण शुक्ला हैं। कोई आसान नाम नहीं रख सकते थे आप? सकीना ने सवाल किया। यह एक बहुत ही यह एक बड़ा ही खानदानी किस्म का ठेठ हिंदू है। मियाँ लोगों के हाथ का छुआ नहीं खाता। या आप खाने लगे हो? इफ़त ने टोपी से सवाल किया। यह अच्छी खबर है, सकीना ने कहा। गवारों के खाने लायक कोई चीज इस वक्त थी भी नहीं। टोपी को यह बात बुरी लगी, इसलिए उसने सकीना की जिद में खा लेने का फैसला कर लिया। उस दिन उसने पहली बार किसी मुसलमान के घर का खाना खाया। अलीगढ़ आकर थाली की आदत तो छूट गई थी, फिर भी जिस डोंगे से इरफान सालन निकाल रहा था, उसी डोंगे से उसने अपने लिए सालन निकालना अजीब लगा। परंतु वह हिम्मत नहीं हारा। दाल का मजा भी कुछ नया था। लहसुन से बघारी हुई अरहर की दाल उसने पहली बार खाई, क्योंकि उसके घर में लहसुन प्याज का तो गुजर ही नहीं था। उसके यहाँ तो पतली दाल में कच्चा घी डाला जाता था। उस मजे का भी जवाब नहीं था, परंतु सकीना की बघारी हुई दाल का मजा भी अपनी जगह था। अब कभी ना कहिए खाने को, टोपी ने खाने के बाद कहा। क्यों? सकीना ने पूछा। अरे भाई, इन्हें समझाओ, टोपी ने इरफान से कहा। मैं बहुत गाढ़ा हिंदू हूँ। मैं भी बहुत गाढ़ी मुसलमान हूँ, सकीना ने कहा। तुम्हारे जाने के बाद इन बर्तनों को खूब धुलवाऊंगी। जो मैं ना खाता तो क्या बर्तन ना धुलते? टोपी ने पूछा। यही तो गद्दापन है मुसलमानों। एंड सो इट एंड्स। Rahi constantly employed this dual register of Bhojpuri and Urdu to bring out uh, the underlying fault lines that were there, that were obviously present in the aftermath of partition. The identity of Indian Muslims, particularly their association with language, and the idea that somehow they represented an alien culture. These were issues that greatly concerned Rai. In both the novels and in several other novels, he takes up these issues constantly, over and over again, in order to prove two very, to me, two very clear things. One, that a discrete Hindu or a discrete Muslim identity simply did not exist. Indeed, the Hindu and Muslim cultures, particularly in several parts of the United Provinces, as indeed in major parts of North India, were so intricately connected to each other that it was very, very difficult to sort of say that this is essentially Muslim or this is essentially Hindu. This, of course, this idea pervaded the domain of language quite obviously. All his characters, speak Bhojpuri, and whether they are Hindus or Muslims in Ada Gaon. Nevertheless, I think he was presenting these ideas and he was projecting these views at a time when Hindu communalism was becoming very, very strong in the 80s. He was committed, as I said, to the secular idea, And he argued for the secular idea, both through his themes as well as through his language. Indeed, as I have tried to show, that the language contestation itself was his way of moving towards some kind of a consensus on not just the issue of language, but also on the issue of identity. Thank you.
All right. So just quite, I mean, we read, some of us have read Adagaon, and quite obvious what you said, the distinction and the differences or the connections were all the time there. Now, Salil Mishra ji is going to conclude what you initiated, and I invite him for the other part, and then after that, we will have the concluding remarks. Salil Mishra ji.
Thank you very much. I basically want to utilize my 24, 22 minutes by focusing on two things. First question is, what would be the broad outline if one were to write a historic story of the partition? So what would be the major elements in such a story? And secondly, what would be the linguistic dimension of this story of the partition? So what is the role of language really? First question first. I think a good story on the partition, good story of the partition, a historic story of the partition should have 3 or 4 preconditions. 1, A, it should be selective rather than an exhaustive story. Facts have to be selected carefully. Not everything which happened before 1947 could be a feature or a factor in the making of the partition. So we need to be careful. Certain things need to be included, certain facts need to be excluded. Secondly, a story of the partition should be an explanatory story and not simply a descriptive story. We need to tell the story of partition so that we are able to explain the partition. Merely telling the story, to my mind, is not enough. C, as far as possible, it should be a non-partisan story, in the sense that it should be relevant for both the nation states across the border. It should have, it should retain a relevance for India as much as for Pakistan. Ideally, there shouldn't be 2 different stories of the partition, one for India and one for Pakistan. So somehow it shouldn't be a very partisan story. And D, it should be a story which should eschew making heroes and villains or culprits. So writing the story should not get into questions like Guilty Men of India's Partition, that indeed is the title of Ram Manohar Lohia's book, or Myth and Reality, or The Untold Story of the Partition, and so on. It should be possible for us to tell the story of the partition without practicing any kind of sensationalism. I know the theme of the partition is such that it lends itself very easily to a kind of sensationalism, but we need to avoid that. One feature of a good story is that one should be able to, one should, on the expansive side, one should be able to expand it to the size of a big book or a novel. But on the other side of compression, there is an expansion side and a compression side. The other side, on the side of compression, we should be able to reduce it to a paragraph or a sentence or one basic sentence, which should be able to tell us the flavor, the story, the crux of the story. I have such a compression in mind, and let me attempt it. So here is my compressed version of the story of partition. Partition was the result of 3 major transformations. One was a community transformation, or a transformation in India's community profile. There was a process in the 19th century which saw the making of pan-Indian communities of Hindus and Muslims with a certain pan-Indian consciousness. These communities did not really exist as an a priori reality. There was a process in which these communities gradually came into being. So there is a kind of a transformation of India's community profile in the 19th century that is an extremely important part of the story of partition. Second is a programmatic transformation. Step by step escalation of the demands made by the Muslim League in such a way that partition began to look like the logical next step. You know, let's say from step 9 to step 10. But if we look at it from step 1 to step 10, it would look completely disconnected. It would look like kind of an absurdity. So there is a kind of a programmatic transformation. And thirdly, an ideological transformation. Transformation from minorityism to communitarianism to liberal communalism to extreme communalism to a point where eventually to a point where it would look like an alternative or a parallel kind of a nationalism, antithetical to the mainstream Indian nationalism. This can be the outline of a story: 3 transformations: community profile, community structure, programmatic, and ideological. This can be one explanatory story of the partition. Today, I will focus briefly on the linguistic component of this story, not the entire story, but how does language come into it. In the range of stories, in the range of academic stories that are available with us, there are 2 contrasting stories which are very significant. They are contrasting not in their conclusions, but they are contrasting in their approach. One is what I would call the intensive and the conjunctural approach. And the best example of this is Sucheta Mahajan's book, Independence and Partition. This is a book which I would recommend. It's about 400-page book, which focuses only and exclusively on the period 1945 to 47, the post-war period. The book treats this period as qualitatively different from the earlier times, focusing therefore, the book focuses more on breaks rather than continuities. The context, post-war context, has a centrality in the book. All the actors are older: the British, Congress, Muslim League, Hindu Mahasabha. The actors are older, but they are all confronted with a very new set of circumstances. And because she has chosen, Sucheta Mahajan has chosen a very small period, she is able to go deep down and explore in depth. Also, she deals with the other important feature of the book is that the book deals with independence and partition together simultaneously. You know, it's like 2 sides of the same coin. Great success of Indian nationalism and equally great failure of Indian nationalism. In this frame, the book focuses not simply on those forces which fed directly into the partition, but the entire cluster of political developments from which emanated these 2 eventualities, independence and partition. So there is a whole cluster, and then at the end of it, you see these 2 processes, 2 outcomes, independence and partition. You can understand one only if you bring in the other. Talking exclusively about one will give us a somewhat inadequate or maybe even a misleading picture. The other approach, which again is very appealing to me and very important, is the expansive one, you know, long duration, long period. And here I would like to introduce to you the work of another historian, Bimal Prasad. He has written a 3-volume magisterial account of the partition, about 1,500 pages. It is called Pathways of India's Partition. It's in 3 volumes. Now his story, Bimal Prasad's story, it starts sometimes in the 18th century. Religious divide, historical memory, some kind of legacy of separativeness drawn from the past. And then the book travels through the 19th century in the 2nd volume. And then the last volume focuses on what he calls the climactic years. And for him, the climactic phase is 1937 to 1947. But there is, in his treatment, there is a kind of a continuity, a long evolution, logical unfolding, a connected chain of events. So he describes events since the 19th century in a very connected kind of manner. He focuses much more on continuities and unfolding and evolutions rather than dramatic and sharp breaks. I feel that a good story of India's partition should be, firstly, very intensive, like Sucheta Mahajan's work, but also expansive, like Bimal Prasad's 3 volumes. In addition, I think a good story of partition should also be comparative. You see, there have been many partitions in the 20th century. From some standpoint, 20th century can be considered a century of partitions. India's partition may be unique and exceptional. It was, in some very crucial sense, it was unique and exceptional. Yet there are some other comparable situations, comparable partitions. They are not identical, but they are also not very different, particularly partitions of Ireland and Palestine. So India, Ireland, and Palestine can actually be seen as 3 very comparable situations. All of them were British colonies. They were under British control. In each case, each of the 3 cases, Ireland, Ireland, Palestine, and India, partition or its contingency of partition, it springs up at a time when the British are in retreat, when they are about to retreat. So in this sense, it could be seen, partition can be seen as connected to the politics of retreating imperialism. Religion is the major criterion for partition in the 3 cases. In each case, India, Palestine, and Ireland, settlement pattern has a very important role to play. You know, Muslims concentrated in Punjab, Sindh, and Bengal, Catholics and Protestants somewhat segregated in Ireland, Ulster and North Ireland, Jews settled in certain pockets of Palestine. So there is something about the settlement pattern which also provides some input, gives some input to the forces fighting for the partition. Large-scale migrations either precede the partition or follow the partition. They precede the partition of Palestine and they follow the partition of India. There can be many more such comparable situations, many more similarities. So a kind of a comparative perspective is another thing which, to my mind, can be an important part of the story of the partition. A good story of partition, good explanatory story of the partition can have some of these features. Let me now go on to my second question. My second question is, I would like to give a brief outline of the linguistic component of the partition. I think most of what I say, I think Sukrita Paul Kumar, Professor Kumar, she actually made all those points. So I'm in a way, I'm just repeating what she said. The priority list is slightly different, but very, very similar points. The outline, my outline of the linguistic component of the partition is as follows. And to begin with, I'm taking a long, century-long approach, many centuries approach. This is my outline. I'm just reading, I'm presenting it as a case. From around the 13th century or so, we see the presence of a large linguistic and literary tradition, and let's call it the Hindavi tradition. And we see it active in many parts of the country, north, South, North, Central India, Western India, and Southern India. It was identified, this tradition, by different names. It had different names, Dehelvi, Gujri, Dakhni, but there were actually more of a continuity in spite of different names and different identifications. Hindvi was the name given by Amir Khusro. He wrote in one of his famous Persian Masnavi Noor Separ, and there is a very nice poem which I would like to read out to you. In this, he lists the names of languages, all of which could be considered or were connected to Hindvi, and you can identify names: Sindhiyo, Lahorio, Kashmiro Gar, Dhur Samandari, Tilgiyo, Gujar, Mabriyo, Goriyo, Bangalo, Awadh, Dilliyo, Param, Kash, Andar, Hamahad, E Hama Hinduis, Zia Yame Kohan, Amma Bakarast, Bahar, Duna Sukhan. Sindhi, Punjabi, Kashmiri, Marathi, Kannada, Telugu, Gujarati, Tamil, Asamiya, Bangla, Avdhi, Delhi, and the language of neighboring areas. All of them have been clubbed together, or he clubs together under this broad rubric of Hindvi. Hindvi, it was a large and inclusive tradition, but it did not really include Sanskrit and Farsi. So it had its boundary lines very clear. It did not, Sanskrit was different, Farsi was different, and then there was Hindvi. It also flourished without a very direct and without any direct official patronage. It lived much more on social movements, traders, their efforts, soldiers. It was codified in both the Perso-Arabic script and the Nagaric script, and it was also circulated orally. So there is a kind of plurality in how it's written and communicated. Produced devotional, romantic, allegorical poetry. It was also the carrier of the ideas of harmony, and religious syncretism. If Amir Khusro was the starting point, I think it reaches its high point with the poetry of Nazir Akbar Abadi, an 18th century poet. Now, for various reasons, this tradition went into a decline since the 18th century. Or let's say the picture in my mind is that there was a reservoir which actually began to dry up. And after a great deal of reconfiguration and mutation and changes, we see the development of two parallel literary creations, Urdu and Hindi. And there is an interesting process in how they acquire these two names. There is nothing given that Urdu would be the tag for one and Hindi for the other, but there is a story about how that happens. Now, so the picture in my mind is that of a parent Hindvi and the offspring Hindi and Urdu. And Hindi and Urdu, they resemble each other also because of a common parentage. Now, at this point, British come into the picture. The British bring a very, very unusual and new idea to India's linguistic landscape. And the new idea is that language belongs not so much to a territory, but to ethnicity or a religion. Now, in this kind of a frame, you would naturally look for the linguistic root of a religion or a religious root of a language. British look for them, and they find them in Hindi. Hindi or Hindui gets identified as a Hindu language, and Urdu or Hindustani as the Muslim language. British also introduced a new patronage system, new jobs, administration, judiciary, etc., particularly from 1830s. And this new patronage system, expansion of administration, education, has serious implications for the linguistic scenario. In the midland, and by that I mean Punjab, UP, Bihar, central provinces, in the midland, Urdu is the main beneficiary of this new patronage system. And then thus begins a new rivalry between Hindi and Urdu. Given the ecosystem of a language, culture, religion congruence. And there is nothing inherent, given, or natural about this congruence. It's an idea particularly of the second half of the 19th century, when they are seen as connected in the sense in which their boundaries overlap. So the boundary of a culture is the boundary of a language, is the boundary of a religion. They are not, they are those kinds of circles. In that kind of a scenario, in this ecosystem of a language, culture, religion congruence, a language rivalry which had developed, it would slip into a rivalry between religious communities. So in a very natural way, through osmosis, a Hindi-Urdu rivalry began to resemble a Hindu-Muslim rivalry. So you have a Hindi-Urdu rivalry for patronage, which has begun to resemble a Hindu-Muslim rivalry. And this rivalry is what the 20th century actually inherits. It's the inheritance for the 20th century from the second half of the 19th century. And at this point, yet another important idea develops, and it casts its shadow on the linguistic scenario. The new idea, the second new idea, the first idea was that language connected to ethnicity and religion, and not so much to territory. The second new idea is that of a language being the bedrock of a nation. Now, this idea too came from Europe, and it was rooted in European experiences, but it may have had not so much of relevance for a country like India, which was linguistically very plural. So early 20th century is a period when the emerging Indian nation is looking for a suitable language, and the language is looking for a nation. So a kind of a congruence, there is a kind of a search. Language is searching for a nation, and the nation is searching for the language. Now, in this scenario, the two languages that I just talked about, they are placed at the service of large political mobilization. Hindi gets allied in a way as the linguistic vehicle for Indian nationalism. And a large chunk of support for Hindi comes actually from non-Hindi speaking areas and people and leaders. Most of the important Hindi leaders during the course of the national movement, they are not Hindi speaking, and they don't even come from Hindi speaking areas. But there is this notion that there should be one single language, either as a national language or as a link language, connecting various regional languages. Urdu's destiny actually gets tied up with the Muslim League and its politics. And the politics of Muslim League changes, evolves. It changes from seeking concessions to reservations, to safeguards, to weightage, to separate recognition, parity for Muslims, and finally it develops into a demand for a separate nation in 1940. The language too gets integrally connected to these kinds of political processes. So the linguistic, this is basically this is the linguistic component, the outline, which then feeds into the partition. So the language story of partition can be understood by drawing upon a great temporal spread. The story of last few centuries, we can actually start with the making of Hindavi and how Hindavi flourished and went into a decline, and then what replaced it, much like the Bimal Prasad approach. But this story, the linguistic component of partition, it also has some very specific and decisive developments and moments and crucial junctures which need to be highlighted and focused upon, much like the Sucheta Mahajan approach. We clearly need both. So this is one way in which the story of partition can be told, and this is one way in which the linguistic dimension in the story of partition can be brought into an explanatory historical story of partition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salil Saab. Somehow our session gone much longer, and we still have to have the concluding remarks. So I would rather request to be brief so that we have a little time left for question and answer. And so if it can be concluded within, 4 or 5 minutes, that will be nice.
Yeah,
And
it could even be actually 2 minutes, Ravi sir,
no,
because
please.
no. What I mean is that, the two speakers have really given a lot of explanation logically and in a very comprehensive style, both. Professor Bodh Prakash and Professor Salil. I think it could have been either way. You could have started, Professor Salil, with the historic, and then the literary manifestation could have been showed up. But I think in all, the story that comes up is a very comprehensive one when both are put together. One is a historical kind of telescoping and also going into the details very logically, which I think is one of our major concerns today, which is to really look at in a very comparative style as to what was happening. I like that point that you make about the comparative style, which the methodology of comparison that could have been used also and should be used. And one of the things that I just want to point out is that when you look at Kamleshwar's novel, for instance, Kitne Pakistan, he's actually talking about, he's not making a scholarly comment on how many partitions have happened, but he's also talking about the context of the subcontinent partition in relation to many other partitions that happened. And he calls it Kitne Pakistan, and which has been translated, I think, as partitions. And as far as the novel in English is concerned, but obviously originally it was written in Hindi, and that's a very valid point. I think we need to see how these partitions happen, and I like the fact that you have also linked it up with the entire the comparative mode, the confluence happening in the context of how three of them were the British colonies, India, Ireland, and Palestine. And so there are reasons to compare because they come on a common plane. I am very keen on the linguistic component that you are referring to, and also the example that you give of Amir Khusro and his Hindavi, those lines of a verse, which in fact, one of the books that I have been very deeply, passionately involved in myself, which is a book which actually Professor Bodh Prakash and Vibha Chauhan and I did it together. And this was called Cultural Diversity, Linguistic Plurality, and Literary Traditions of India. Long title, but each has its own place, each part of the title. Now, there also, in the introduction, I'm quoting Hindavi, Amir Khusro's note on Hindavi, where he's talking about the multiplicity of languages and the one that you quoted. Now, the point I'm wanting to link up with is this point vis-a-vis the eventual, kind of development, or I would say it's a kind of a regression, because Amir Khusro is putting his finger on multilinguality of this country, while on the other hand you have, or the subcontinent, on the other hand you have the monolingual kind of pattern that I would say, which is being copied from the Britishers in one sense. I mean, we could have continued with this multilinguality, which today we are talking about in a big way, with G.N. Davy having done People's Linguistic Survey of India and having realized that there are more than 800 mother tongues in this part of the world, more than 800. So there are things that need to be learned, lessons that need to be learned, particularly one with the historical methodology, that the one that Professor Salil has used. And on the other hand, you see the literary representation of the same by, going to somebody like Rahi Masoom Raza, which has been, who has been quoted by Bodh in a very extensive way and very beautifully in a detailed way, by giving actual examples of the contestation between, say, Bhojpuri and Urdu, and how that gets represented in, in the novels. So the literary representation is a very convincing kind of explanation to what is historically presented by Salil. And I think kudos to both of them for completing each other's argument by using two different disciplines in a very effective fashion. Thank you very much for doing it, and that's it.
Thank you all. Thank you all three speakers. And now before we go to question and answer session, this is coming week's event. Professor Ashoka Modi from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs is going to talk on his book, India is Broken, A People Betrayed Independence to Today. He will be, or the theme will be introduced by Shrayana Bhattacharya, who is a senior economist at the World Bank, and the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Abu Saleh Sharif, a well-known economist and much more known as the Executive Secretary of Sachar Commission, who is now the president of the Center for Research and Debate in Development, New Delhi, as well as the chief scholar at the US-India Policy, Washington, DC. So please just remember that we have a time change. So for Indian subcontinent, it will be 8:30 p.m. Rather than usual 9:30. And here it will be same 11 a.m. And now over to Dr. Rafat Hussain, who will be moderating the question and answer session. Rafat?
Thank you, Razi Bhai.
Not much time is left, but whatever time you can allot.
Yeah. So before we begin the question and answer session, I would like to thank Professor Bodh Prakash and Professor Salil Mishra for informative talks on the linguistic roots of partition of India. And of course, the introductory and concluding remarks by Sukrita Paul Kumar. And since we have blocked the chat, so I don't see any comment on the chat. Can we reopen, Razi Bhai? So
I just reopened the chat so people can post something.
Thank you. So you can raise your digital hand or a physical hand if you are unable to raise the digital hand. And you can also put your question in the chat box, or you can ask the speakers directly. So as Razi Bhai said, the time is limited, so please be brief, those who are asking the question, as well as the speakers are responding to their questions or queries or comments. So let's begin with the raised hand first. And our own Satyanath Chaudhary Saab, please unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk very much. I joined a little late, so I did not hear Sucheta ji fully. Anyway, so my question is, or comment, whatever. Personally, I feel that it's some parts of community, wherever it is, I mean, it could be applied to perhaps to Ireland and Palestine, as well as India, that has some advantage economically, educationally, they're a little better off. They have a tendency to strengthen that advantage, of course, to the disadvantage of the disadvantaged. And that is what really leads to these fissiparous tendency, and it's kind of a distraction to find other origins of partition or conflict and things. What really needs to be done is to somehow try to equalize the society, and that's what can bring about peace. And partition happened in 47, but that kind of conflict hasn't died off. It has only intensified. Thank you very much.
So it was sort of a comment, but if Professor Prakash or Mishra would like to say anything.
Well, I'll just briefly answer it. Well, this is too general a point. All societies have their elite, and all elite would like to preserve their privileges, their positions, etc. Now, the question is, why does it necessarily take this form? There has to be a certain specificity, and that is what we need to focus on. To say that equalization of conditions will solve the problem. This used to be an old argument when it used to be argued, particularly in the Indian case, that you don't really need to fight against communalism, just fight for better conditions, socialism, etc., and take care of the problem. That is obviously, I don't think it works that way. Communal problem has its own specificity, and that has got to be recognized.
Okay, thank you. Keshav Bansal Saab.
Yeah, am I audible clearly?
Yes, very.
Okay, so my question pertains to, the panel talked chiefly about the linguistic roots of partition vis-a-vis the divide of Hindi and Urdu. Was there this case of linguistic division among other languages, say Punjabi, because the Pakistan side writes in Shahmukhi and the Indian side writes in Gurumukhi now. Similarly, the case of Sindhi or other languages that existed on both sides of the border. Also, I would like to shed light on the linguistic implications of the partition regarding the institutionalization of Hindi in North India. One of the speakers mentioned Ganesh Devi's People's Linguistic Survey of India. Now he has, in the region or the geography of North India, mentioned several languages, so to speak, like Rajasthani or Haryanvi or Bhojpuri, Awadhi, Braj, Bundeli, that are now referred to as or relegated as the dialects of Hindi. So this dialect, this making of dialects, or this institutionalization of Hindi as the language of North India, can we look at it as the linguistic implication of partition?
I think this question is to me. There are two dimensions of the question. First is, what about other languages other than Hindi and Urdu? Yes, there were many languages which were more victims of the partition. Punjabi, Bengali, they were split up, also Sindhi. But as far as a linguistic component into communalism, or what is called linguistic communalism, is concerned, that battle was confined very much to Hindi and Urdu. But as both pointed out, there were multiple other fault lines, Urdu versus Bhojpuri, various other, Hindi versus Awadhi, and that those kinds of battles went on. But Hindi Urdu acquired a particular centrality as far as the is concerned. Your second question, again, it is a very, very general point. The history, the linguistic history of the world is that of homogenization. There were a large number of speech communities and languages in the world about 400, 500, 600 years ago. And the history is that these numbers have shrunk. How have they shrunk? Many languages have merged to create large languages. In the era of literacy and print, that tendency gets even greater impetus. So in a way, it's a part of the ongoing history of languages. In this selection, certain languages get selected in this large pool, and they begin to put forward claims. But otherwise, it's a part of the generic history of languages, not just in India, but in the world, that many languages have been merging to produce fewer languages, which somehow get selected. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Next person is Muzaffar Ahmad Dar. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you both, sir, and Salil, sir, for your wonderful presentations. My question is to Salil, sir. to go back a little bit to Sir Said Ahmed Khan. His perception, initially his argument, like India is like a bride and Hindu and Muslims are its two eyes. Later on, he changed his perception, when he said that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together and one will try to dominate other community. So what led him to this perception from Hindu-Muslim unity to the creation of two-nation theory?
You see, Sir Syed was part of a patronage system. He represented the elite of UP. This was a section which had done very well thanks to the patronage system extended by the British. Now, with the formation of the Congress, a very new kind of a narrative takes over. The first demand of Congress is towards democratization, jobs through representations, etc. Now, these are the kind of demands which are likely to hit the interests of that elite who were represented by Sir Syed, which was precisely the point that was made at the beginning. And then he begins to how to safeguard the interests, and he feels that the community argument is going to be very, very effective. So behind the facade of community argument, there was very much the attempt to preserve the advantages, the privileges of a dominant group, dominant class in UP that was represented by Sir Syed.
Thank you, Professor. Next person is Syed Hussain Sir, my Hamna.
Thank you so much, Raziyuddin Saab, for the nice program, and also the speakers who have enlightened us so much. I have a few comments and a question. My comments are that I don't think that anybody could deny the fact that development of Urdu was an indigenous Indian phenomenon from the very beginning of its inception, and then it reaching its heights in the late 20th century. Unfortunately, in the process of partition, this language became a challenge to be accepted as the language of the indigenous India, and they started to label that as a Muslim or a Hindi or Urdu or Hindi. With that comment, I also want to tell you that in the development of this language and in the popularity of this language, not only the poets played a major role, but the Bollywood played a major role. And now the Bollywood became the place where they will try to steer the language issue to a different way of expressing it, not calling as an Urdu movies, but calling it as a Hindi movies. And I would like to know why this kind of a trend was so much focused, because of course, Bollywood being a very popular place to reach people, unfortunately, has there been any effort to kind of not use that as a media and to damage one language on top of the other? Thank you.
Who wants to take Professor Mishra or Professor Prakash?
Well, I don't know. This is more for contemporary times. So if Bodh would like to take it up, otherwise I
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Bodh is there. Yeah.
No, I just think that what you're calling Bollywood cinema has actually done a wonderful job of popularizing a language which, which is actually a composite language. I think the unfortunate thing is that, if you look at the cinema from the 50s and the 60s, 40s, the language which is being used is Hindustani. It is neither Hindi. Sorry, am I audible?
Yes. You are okay.
It's neither Urdu in a certain sense, nor is it Hindi in a certain. It's certainly not high Urdu. It's certainly not high Hindi. It's a mixed language. It's a hybrid language, And more importantly, it is the spoken language. And I think we need to make this distinction because it's a very important distinction. When it comes to scholarship, when it comes to the written word, there is a difference. You know, the way we speak the language is very, very different. Even today, if you look at people who call themselves Hindi speakers, I mean, I consider myself a Hindi speaker, and yet I am all at sea in the Hindi of the classroom, the scholarly Hindi. I mean, I don't understand so much of it. And I use so many words which many speakers of Urdu would say are Urdu words, you know. So what I'm trying to say is that the so-called, what you might call Hindi cinema is actually Hindustani cinema. Unfortunately, what has happened since the 80s and particularly after that in the 90s is post-liberalization, that there is a move away not from Urdu or Hindustani. There is a move towards a different kind of hybrid language, which will include English, for instance. You know, this is the language of the new middle classes. You know, which is a kind of hybrid language which combines Hindi with English now.
English.
So I wouldn't say, I think and you can sort of listen to so many people who are very well informed about the Hindi film industry, including people like Javed Akhtar and various others who have, Nasiruddin Shah, who've talked about it, and how the Hindi cinema has played a very, very important role in the popularization of a common language. You know, we get
Why?
stuck in labels, unfortunately, which is I think not very useful.
Professor Bodh, then I would
What
ask
do you
the
think?
question, why don't you call these movies as Hindustani movies than calling it Hindi movies?
Of course,
Okay,
I
and
agree with you.
I will make another comment. Another comment. That comment is to say that even Mahatma Gandhi had favored using Hindustani as the language of the country. But unfortunately, Mahatma was Mahatma. He was, put aside. Secondly, that if the Hindustani is the spoken language, why not? My feeling is that it is the hate of the politics, the political hate, which has created this situation and has affected the language, which is sad because spoken language, as you mentioned, the Hindustani should be the language and there should not be no hate, no issues on that.
Okay, all right.
Agreed. Thank you. Abdul Jabbar Saab.
So thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentations very much. I have a question regarding the introduction of English during the British Raj. Does it have any effect on how the local languages are perceived or by common people, and maybe there is a tendency, kind of superiority of the English over the local languages, other languages, where that shaped the thinking of people?
Well, quite obviously, I think once the English language is introduced, I mean, English language belongs to the colonial master, and therefore, quite naturally, there is a hierarchy in which it is right at the top. English is always also the language of opportunity. I mean, if you know English, you get jobs. So naturally, I mean, it leads to a certain kind of hierarchization, which is inevitable. And we could talk more if we had more time about how English and the introduction of English and its perceived superiority actually leads to all kinds of reorientations within literature in Indian languages also. I mean, there is a whole debate about how writers who are writing in other Indian languages. Today, of course, English is also one of the Indian languages, but even then, writers who were writing in other Indian languages were very strongly they were aware of, many of them knew English, they were aware of works across the world in which were available in English. So English functioned, or the introduction of English functioned, in several kinds of ways. It was both debilitating as well as enabling. And I think we need to recognize both these aspects of English within our context.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next is Salman Qureshi, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed all three speakers, especially Bodh Prakash, who really illustrated Rahi Masoom Raza's fiction, and that was brilliant. My question is that, in the context of writers and poets, somehow Faiz was missed in the list that Professor Bodh Prakash had. And I mentioned Faiz not because he was a famous Urdu poet, but in the way in which Professor Amir Mufti, for example, has written about Faiz, that his central theme of his entire poetry was partition. And he takes partition to be, in a very deep sense, the division between, the self and the question of minority culture. In his book called The Enlightenment in the Colony, the Jewish question and the crisis of post-colonial culture, he's a whole chapter on Faiz. I was curious to know if any of you, those who have spoken, would regard that as an important contribution, because it really, in addition to Manto and others, it puts Faiz in the center of this debate about nationalism, language. And, the poems that he mentioned, for example, Blackout and Ek Sipahi Ka Marsiya, which are pure Hindvi. Sipahi Ka Marsiya, you read, which Faiz wrote, at the time of the 1965 war, you can't decide whether it was for an Indian soldier or a Pakistani soldier. It's written in such a language. So I'm just curious to know if you have any comments.
Well, certainly. I mean, that was. Faiz's position is really very, very. His position cannot be questioned in the world of Urdu letters. And the reason, I think, that I was basically looking at writers, at the writers who had produced fiction on partition, and I was not talking so much about the poets. Your point about, I think it's a very significant intervention in regarding Faiz and the whole issue of minority culture. Incidentally, with regard to language, what you're saying about Ek Sipahi Ka Marsiya, in fictional representations also, as Sukrita was pointing out, there are examples of people like Rajinder Singh Bedi, for instance, and we've done this because we did it for a reader. When you read, if you were to sort of just read aloud a story by Rajinder Singh Bedi, it would be very difficult for anybody sitting here even to tell us if it is a story in Urdu or in Hindi. Because there is a point, most of these major writers do write in a language which is not, which cannot be identified only as Urdu or as Hindi. There is, of course, the script, which is a giveaway at some point. But I really sort of very strongly feel this. I can understand spoken Urdu. There's no problem. I understand it because I am a speaker of Hindi. I believe that I can, I can manage that. So, and so is it with many poets. The unfortunate part really is that there was a tendency, and Salil will bear me out of this, at certainly towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when there was a deliberate attempt to Persianize the language on the one hand and Sanskritize it on the other. And that led to this kind of divergence, which was, it seems to me, very harmful. The creative writers many creative writers did not fall for it also. So even though you may have been an Urdu writer, you are still writing in what I'm calling Hindustani. You may be a Hindi writer, but you're writing in Hindustani, which I'm sort of considering to be the hybrid kind of language.
Thank you, Professor. Razi Bhai, I don't see any chat or any more question. Just a quick comment before I hand over to you.
Sure.
So I was just listening to Professor Prakash. So for the real Urdu or the literary Urdu, even the Muslims can't understand that. It is so difficult. But what we speak in general is a Hindustani. It's a mixture of Hindi and Urdu, as you very well said. But if you are really good in Urdu, it is very difficult to understand, at least for the general public. That's a simple comment. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Raziva.
Well, it's quite long a time, and I'm also still not very normalized in 1 day only. So I think it's about time that we wind it up and just conclude it with this take-home message that, well, there is a lot to learn from such kind of stories and such kind of discussions. And we know that there is a literature which is more Ganga Jamni or inclusive, and there is a literature which is more more towards exclusion or pointing the fault lines to other. So this is the story of partition, or this is the story of the subcontinent. Unfortunately, these are the realities to learn from, and that's it. What else I can say? Thank you a lot, both Prakash ji, Salil Mishra ji, and Sukrita ji, for presenting a very well-researched,
indeed,
thoughtful indeed. We learned a lot, and I think we should have more and more sessions like this, which brings a lot of real values rather than mythical and other thing. A lot has to be no. People have to learn a lot. We have somehow a sort of knowledge deficit on this particular topic, partition. We just try to not to talk about it, because anything that is hurtful, we have a tendency not to talk about it. Unlike in the West, where people really visit and learn from it, talk about it. Anyway, thank you a lot, and it is late for you guys, and we conclude it. And now if anybody wants to stay here, we can chat. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.